welcome again to another Central State Seminar Talk. Today we're privileged to have Jerry Tebben from Columbus, Ohio, who writes a coin article on a regular basis.
Every month?
And I talked to him about, could he come to Cincinnati and give a talk? And he said, what about? And I said, your choice. Your choice of topic. There it is. And I think we're all looking forward to this. Jerry, welcome to Cincinnati.
Thank you. Well, you know who I am. I want to give credit first off to the photo. The photo comes from Coin Values, and today's talk is based on an article that I wrote for Coin Values a 3 years ago. I write about the history and romance of coins. I love the investment aspect too, but the thing that turns me on is what they tell us about who we are and who the countries are that we collect. And this coin is just striking in what it does. There's not a general on it. There's not a president on it. There's not a famous person on it all. But there are 21 identifiable names of people who died on a particular day, really, in Viet Nam. And it just tells, it's the only coin I know that commemorates the sacrifice of common people. Not that there's anything common about a hero, but of common people. Before we start, I want you just to point out a couple things about the coin. There are 21 names on this coin, 21 identifiable names of people who died in Vietnam in November 1965, mostly within a few minutes of each other. I'm going to talk about the coin today, the memorial, and the wall. But right now, I'd like you to take a look at the coin and think about the guys whose names are here. Donald G. Green's name is right up here, right below the L. He died on the first day of his tour of duty. Below his name is James L. Riley. Riley died at 3:30 p.m. November 16th in a helicopter crash. Edward D. All's name is below Riley's. I'm sorry, Earl D. All's name. He survived a freak shot, only to die a couple minutes later. Charles W. Bass's name is below All's. Master Sergeant Charles W. Bass died at 1:10 p.m. November 17th at the start of a battle. Rolly Lee Bolden's name is just below the nearest finger. Spec Rolly Lee Bolden was a 23-year-old draftee. He loved Elvis and fast cars. The thumb touches the name of Bernard J. Creed. And I got to find it right there. Under his thumb, that's right, thank you. Sergeant Bernard J. Creed at 40 is the oldest person on the coin. You can see the W of W.A. Farrell's name below the thumb, right there. Though his memory is equally honored. Sergeant William A. Farrell served in World War II and Korea, where he had been a POW. People go to the wall every day. If you've ever been there, you can't help but cry. It's just an amazing memorial. Aging warriors go, aged parents, children who never knew their fathers, and they see the names and they touch them, and they make rubbings of them, and they leave behind letters and cigarettes and cans of beer, touchstones for lives lost young decades ago. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is a polished black granite V on the National Mall between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. It encourages reflection and tears and a yearning for what might have been. Despite initial opposition to what some called a black gash of shame, the wall was quickly embraced by all sides after its dedication in 1982 as a singularly moving monument to the service and sacrifice of Vietnam-era soldiers. 11 years later, Congress passed the United States Veterans Commemorative Coin Act of 1993, calling for the minting of a silver dollar emblematic of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. John Mercanti designed the 1994 Coins of Verse, which shows a woman's hand touching the name on the wall. Thomas D. Rogers designed the reverse, which shows 3 Vietnam War service medals. The wall marches east and west from a central point along a timeline that begins in 1959, when the first deaths were recorded to 1975, when South Vietnam collapsed. Names are listed alphabetically after each date. Mercanti's design shows a portion of panel 3 east of the wall, recording some of the deaths of November 16 and 17, 1965. Most of the men whose names appear on the wall died during the Battle of Ia Drang. I'm going to advance the slide, or try to. Okay, thank you. The battle was the subject of the 1992 book and 2002 movie, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, by Lieutenant Harold G. Moore, retired, who commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. and author Joseph L. Galloway, who wrote the book. The wall marches east and west from a central point along a timeline that begins in 1975. Most of the men whose name appear on the coin fell during the Battle of Ia Drang. Some 234 U.S. soldiers died between November 14 and 17, 1965, in fighting surrounding landing zones X-Ray and Albany. About 70 were killed in the surrounding area before and after the big battles. Officials at the time reported that 1,200 communists were dead. Moore and Galloway wrote, all of the names, 305 of them, including one Air Force pilot, are engraved on a third panel to the right of the apex, panel 3 east of the Viet Nam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., and in our hearts. Mercanti's design shows the names on the left side of lines 66 through 79, and these are the stories behind some of those names. Maybe. Following an October 1965 North Vietnamese attack on the Plai Mae Special Forces camp, the cavalry was ordered to find and destroy the enemy in the strategically important Central Highlands. Moore led the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry into Ia Drang Valley at 10:48 a.m. November 14, as 8 helicopters touched down at landing zone X-Ray. 90 minutes later, as the men were cracking open the rations, fighting started. There's a couple pictures from the start of the battle. The battle is well documented. There are even combat footage of it. And it's startling to look at it. It's even more startling to look at the combat footage and compare it to the movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young, which is just a great movie. You can see the tall grasses being pushed down by the helicopter blades. James O'Reilly is the first one to die. On Tuesday, November 16, 1965, his name appears just below the L in Liberty, and he was on Huey Helicopter 62-12538 when it went down after refueling during the Ia Drang battle, just before 3:30 p.m. On the coin, the J and the A and part of the M in James' name are missing, but Riley's name appears in full. Riley 30 began his one-year tour of duty 21 days before his death. 3 other crew members also died in that accident, that crash. They were listed initially as missing in action, and it caused some consternation. There were periodic reports that Billy Knight was seen, but none were true, and in the end it was determined that all died in the crash. They didn't even survive the crash. They just went down. This is the start of the battle. At 9 a.m. November 17, the 400 or so surviving soldiers at landing zone X-Ray, which is off on the left, were ordered to march 3 to 4 miles to other locations, landing zones Albany and Columbus, to get out of the way of a planned 11/17 bombing of Chuapong. The soldiers marched northeast from landing zone X-Ray for about 2 miles. At 10:58 a.m., the column split into 2. The 2nd Battalion of the 5th Cavalry continued northeast to landing zone Columbus, arriving there without incident at 11:38 a.m. The rest of the column, mostly members of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry, turned northwest for an additional 2-mile march to the much larger landing zone Albany. Shortly before noon, 2 soldiers were captured about 100 yards east of Albany. And Albany is this. The prisoners claimed to be deserters, but Master Sergeant Charles W. Bass thought they looked too well fed and armed to be on the run. At this point, the men of Alpha, Delta, Charlie, excuse me, I lost my place, of Alpha, Delta, Charlie, and HQ companies of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry, as well as Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion of the 5th Cavalry, were strung out along a 550-yard line running west from a stream to the clearing that was designated Landing Zone Albany. When news of the capture reached Lieutenant Colonel Robert McCade at the 2nd Battalion, commander at HQ Company, toward the rear of the column, McCade moved forward to check out the situation. He called his company commanders together, and the group walked ahead of the column into the clearing and toward the wooded island. By 1:07 p.m., McDade and the command group were in a clump of trees. The remainder of the battalion was dispersed in a column. Bass, Sergeant Major James Scott, and a translator were questioning the prisoners at 1:10 p.m. when what Moore calls the most savage one-day battle of the Vietnam War began. Bass was the first of 155 U.S. soldiers to die in 16 hours of bloody, often hand-to-hand fighting at Landing Zone X-Ray. "I hear Vietnamese talking," Bass said moments before the attack began, Moore later wrote. The interpreter, with fear in his voice, said, "Yes, they're North Vietnamese Army." Bass said they're up in the trees just before falling in a hail of enemy and small arms fire. Bass, 35, had already served 1 tour as an advisor to the South Vietnamese Army when he volunteered to return as an operations sergeant. An old man on the mission, other NCOs turned to him for advice and guidance. All but part of the C in Charles W. Bass's name appears on the coin. "We had no idea what was going on at first," an American captain told the New York Times. "Then suddenly we realized it was an ambush. But by then, they were all around us, jumping out of trees and charging out of bushes." Alpha Company is right here. As McDade headed toward the tree, Alpha Company, which was the head of the column, sent its 1st, 2nd, and recon platoons to the north, south, and western edges of the clearing. William A. Farrell, platoon sergeant, knew war. He had served in World War II and had been a prisoner of war in Korea. His age and experience earned him the nickname Pappy. Farrell's 2nd platoon was decimated by withering enemy fire at the very beginning of the battle. Colonel Joel Sugdennis told Moore, "Farrell came on the radio. I couldn't pinpoint his location. I knew where he should have been, directly east of our island. Pappy then radioed he was hit. There were 3 or 4 men with him, all hit. I could hear the firing at his location over the radio. I never heard from Pappy again. He did not survive." Gerald B. Evans. At 1:20 p.m., Lieutenant Gordon Grove, the red-haired commander of the 2nd Platoon, stumbled back to Alpha Company's perimeter at the edge of the clearing with 2 wounded men, Sergeant Gerald Evans, 35, and a machine gunner. First Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, author of the 1999 book Baptism of Vietnam Memoir, wrote that Grove reported to Sugdennis, "Everyone's dead or wounded, so they can't move. Radio's smashed. We're the only ones who could make it." A medic treated the pair, but Evans, who had suffered multiple fragmentation wounds, including a gash on his shoulder, didn't stand a chance. A medic treated the pair, but Evans, who had suffered multiple fragmentation wounds, including a gash on his shoulder, didn't stand a chance. As enemy soldiers attacked the position, Evans, with a morphine syringe dangling from his shirt, was sitting still with his eyes glazed over and a cigarette stuck to his lips. Gwynn wrote, "This couldn't be happening. I thought it was worse than any nightmare that I ever dreamed. In 15, maybe 20 minutes, we had been cut off and surrounded, lost 2 of our 4 platoons, half of our people, more than 50 men, and God knows what was happening to the rest of the battalion." Rollie Lee Bolden. Spec 4 Rollie Lee Bolden was a 23-year-old draftee from Albany, Oregon, who liked Elvis and fast cars and thought about becoming a minister. He died helping the wounded. Bolden's brother, Paul, wrote in an internet posting, "I remembered how kind you were. When we learned of your death, it was no surprise that the note accompanying your Bronze Star simply stated that you had been killed while repeatedly returning to help the wounded." Paul said his family never learned anything about how his brother died and did not know that his brother's name was on the commemorative coin until I contacted him. Larry J. Banks and Danny E. Carlton. 2 other men of Alpha Company are represented on the coin. Sergeant Larry J. Banks, who was 29, and PFC Donald E. Carlton, 20. Both fell to small arms fire at the landing zone. The middle finger of the hand on the coin touches and obscures Banks's last name. All of Carleton's name, except for the D and part of the A in Danny, are covered by the hand. Charlie Company. Gwynn wrote the battalion, roughly 400 strong when it left X-ray, had suffered more than 70% casualties, 155 dead, 124 wounded. Charlie Company was the hardest hit, losing all but 9 of its 110 men. Donald C. Cornett, first lieutenant. He was a Charlie Company executive officer. He died in the tall grass as the 550-yard column was attacked. Soldiers were falling all around him when Cornett, 24, was shot in the back just to the right of his spine. Another shot ripped through one of his boots, ripping off his toes. In agony, Cornett told Spec 4 Jack Smith that he was going to try to organize his troops and crawled off into the elephant grass. Moore wrote, "A brave young lieutenant died doing his duty somewhere out there in hand-to-hand fighting." Cornett received a Silver Star posthumously. Second Lieutenant Earl All, a Charlie Company platoon leader, evaded death from a freak shot early in the battle, only to die a short while later. "They almost got me," All told Lieutenant Bud Alley during the fight. "A bullet ricocheted off the .45 caliber pistol he carried in his shoulder holster." A short while later, after a U.S. plane made a strafing run over the area, All said, "We better go now." The plan was to run 5 paces through the tall grass and drop to avoid being targeted. All jumped up and disappeared. Alley told Moore, "I never saw or heard from him again." Spec 4 Kenneth E.R. Birch and PFC Brian F. Carlquist, 22, fell to small arms fire with their Charlie Company brothers. Only the K.E. of Birch's name is visible on the coin. He was a 23-year-old draftee. Carlquist's full name appears on the coin just below the tip of the hand's thumb. Carlquist enlisted. Delta Company. Delta Company was just ahead of Alpha Company. Ralph W. Brown, a 23-year-old draftee, died from multiple fragmentation wounds there. Sergeant Bernard J. Creed, 40, who was the oldest man to appear on the coin, also died from multiple fragmentation wounds. Creed was a seasoned soldier, having served a machine gunner with the 121st Battalion Regiment in Europe during World War II, and as a mortar platoon sergeant in Korea. James R. Dragati and Frederick C. Hiriad. PFC James R. Dragati was a 21-year-old draftee from New York City whose tour of duty began November 3, just 2 weeks before he died. Hiriad was another 21-year-old draftee. He had arrived in Vietnam on August 16, 1965, and planned to become a teacher after his service was up. Fellow soldier Brian Ripley recounted his death in an internet posting. "Fred died in the jungle in the Ia Drang Valley when our unit was attacked in an ambush. He died next to me shortly after 1 p.m. in the afternoon." His funeral was held December 4 at the Church of Good Shepherd in Oswego, Illinois, on his 22nd birthday. The coin bears the names of 2 other men who died at Ia Drang that day. Spec 4 Charles A. Collins is a 23-year-old draftee who is serving in the brigade's headquarter company. And PFC James R. Hines. Hines was a 24-year-old draftee with the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Bravo Company. The names of 4 men who died elsewhere in Vietnam appear on the coin. I'm going to show you their pictures. This is Donald George Green. He was an Air Force captain, and he died on his first day of his tour of duty when his F-105 crashed into the sea shortly after it was hit by fragments from a near miss of a surface-to-air missile. Green, a 23-year-old career aviator from Baldwin Park, California, was flying his first mission over North Vietnam. It was armed reconnaissance between Hanoi and the sea when disaster struck. A note on the virtual wall, which is a great website regarding the Vietnam Memorial, said he managed to fly his aircraft some 40 miles over water, hoping to make it to Da Nang or to eject near a U.S. warship. Instead, he was killed when the aircraft crashed in the Gulf of Tonkin. His body was not recovered. Another person who appears on the coin is Hospital Corpsman Ronald R. Hornbrook. He was a 21-year-old Navy volunteer. He died in fighting in Quang Tin. Richard W. Schwendler, a Marine Corporal, 21, was hit by his enemy small arms fire in Quang Nang. On November 17, there's only one death that appears on the coin, and that's of Rudolph J. Galarza. He was a Marine Corporal. He was 22. He was from Chicago, and he was killed by small arms fire at Quang Nang. A fellow Marine wrote, in an internet posting in May of 2006. Hey, Rudy, it's over 40 years and I still miss you. I'm old and fat now, but you'll be young forever. This is pretty much the view that Mercanti used when he created the coin. Mercanti said he wasn't aware of the significance of the portion of the wall when he chose it for the Viet Nam Memorial silver dollar. When I contacted him, he said he knew the exact perspective he wanted. And that's what he went for. I was just drawn to that point on the wall. I still get a chill talking about it, he said. It's almost as if fate brings you to a certain spot. The boys were meant to be memorialized. The coin shows a woman's hand touching the wall, and I like to know who appears on coins. I'm always fascinated, I think we all are, by who the liberty is that Longacre used and who the liberty is that St. Gaudens used. Well, the coin has a woman's hand, and it's a real woman. She works for the Mint. She used to work for the Mint. I think she's retired now. She worked in the marketing department. And her name was Barbara Bradford. She posed for the photograph. Mercanti said originally they didn't want a hand touching the wall. They wanted a person leaving a rose. But he thought that concept just didn't work, even though you can see lots of roses behind there. What he wanted was a coin that showed almost a photographic perspective. And he thinks it's one of the most powerful coins he's ever designed. I'm proud of that coin, he said. That's my presentation. Are there any coins, any questions? This is probably the oddest talk you've ever been to. There's not hardly any mention of coins in here and their value and their mintages. Just about what it is and what it means.
That's refreshing. Jerry, you mentioned that Mr. Mercanti just saw a certain part of the wall, something struck him, and he just went ahead and used that portion without knowing the significance of the names?
He did not. He did not know them until I called him one day, and I asked him, I had done the research on the names, and I asked him, that was just genius that you picked that spot. If there's one spot on the wall that encapsulates Vietnam, that's it, the Battle of Ia Drang. And he didn't know it. He said he wanted the perspective. He wanted the Washington Monument in the background. He wanted a hand touching it, and it was just that location.
What's curious to me is, was there no thought in his mind that he ought to contact the families or those people, or those names, they're real human beings?
I mean, I would have, but no, he did not.
not.
And that's not to cast aspersion on him. The Mint did not.
No, I'm not.
No, I mean, it's not callous toward him. The Mint did not contact these people. This coin was released, I mean, we all knew about it, but without any ceremony, without any much fanfare. I contacted relatives of the men whose names are there, and they didn't know that their relatives had been memorialized on the coin. They went out to buy it, actually, after they learned about it. You would have thought that the government at least given them a coin. And that's just amazing. But what strikes me about the coin is the simple thing that it's real people. It's not generals, well, they're real people too, but it's just
Average people.
Yeah, average people, thank you.
That is fascinating.
Well, I thank you for your time.
You made the right choice with that hand.
I think so too.
Much better than
Try to picture it as a rose, and it just